Now, we heard earlier from Dr. Jim Swire, the parent of one of the victims of the Lockerbie crime, atrocity that took place over Scotland in 1988. But he doesn't speak for all the parents and all the families of those who were lost. Frank Dugan, for example, is the president of Pan Am Flight 103 victims in the United States, and he has no doubt that al-Megrahi is guilty and should have served out his time in prison regardless of his health. He says it was wrong to release him on compassionate grounds, and I quote, Mr McCaskill said the British government said it had no obligation to honour its agreement that the prisoner would serve his term in Scotland. They said they gave no such assurances to the US government, and that's just not true. It is clear that the agreement was made that he would spend his entire term, the rest of his life, in Scotland. He believes there must be other reasons for his release. Many other prisoners in the UK are terminally ill, but they have not been granted their freedom. Why, in this case? He believes it's an outrage. And as for Jack Straw's revelation that trade was a consideration, if this is true, it would be an outrage. If there was a direct connection with trade, particularly oil, then the connection is with Britain, not with Scotland, and I think the Brits will have something to answer for. So let's hear from Frank, who's on the line in the United States. Frank, thanks very much.
Okay, glad to speak to you.
Now, you were the lawyer of the families in the United States, and you've got very forthright views. We've just had Dr. Swire on, who has a different take on it. Tell us, please, first, why you're so convinced that Libya and al-Megrahi was responsible, and why you discount the compassionate release arguments.
Well, first of all, I am a lawyer. I'm a retired lawyer. But I don't represent them. I'm the president of the group. They made me the president of this family group. And I've been working with them for 20 years.
How many families, Frank? How many families?
I don't know. I honestly don't know. I don't think we've ever counted them. Originally, there were about 3 separate groups. This was always the largest one, and it's the only one now.
Okay.
There were some differences early on, and some people broke away and formed other groups, as often happens.
Yeah.
But there's only one group. And
No, sure. I just wanted to establish whether there was unanimity, really, amongst the families in the United States, which there clearly isn't in Britain.
Yes, there is. I can tell you that. There's a difference of opinion as to how compassionate we should be, but there's no difference of opinion as to the guilt of Mr. Megrahi.
Tell us then. Tell us why you're so convinced about that, because not many people in Britain are any longer convinced.
Well, I don't know how to explain it. I mean, anyone who looks at the evidence, 8 judges have already looked at this and decided that the man was guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. There's no question. In anyone's mind that I know of who's looked at the evidence, the man was guilty.
But there is a question, because the Scottish Criminal Cases Review Board ordered another appeal on the grounds that there may have been a miscarriage of justice.
Well, they did do that, and they studied it for something like 3 years, as I recall. They went through about 45 of the allegations raised by Dr. Swire and Professor Black and a bunch of others, and dismissed them all. They did say there were 3 or 4 that they recommended that a court look at again. And if I recall, most of the 3 or 4 went to the question of the credibility of this witness, Mr. Gauci, who was the fellow from the shop in Malta who identified Megrahi as the person that bought the bag and the clothes that went into the bag that had the bomb. This man, I don't know anything about the man. I think he's an honorable guy just trying to do what he thinks is right. He was interviewed 19 times over the course of 10 years by various law enforcement groups. There were 19 law enforcement, 19 countries involved, but he was interviewed 19 times, and there were some differences in what he said over all these different interviews, which is natural. Anyone would have some differences in what they say if the questions are posed a different way. The issue comes down to, was this man, on the overall, credible? And the judges who looked at him, who saw him being cross-examined, all of them said, yes, this is a credible man. We believe him. Now, Dr. Swire doesn't believe him. I'm sorry about that, but everyone else seems to believe him who's looked at this case.
Why did the U.S. government pay him several $1 million?
They never did. Who said that?
Yeah,
Dr. Swire. Let me say one thing. And forgive me if I raise my voice because I really get angry. We keep hearing about witnesses being bribed. We hear about new witnesses who have new evidence, all sorts of things that are just not true. Who said we paid a man $2 million? It's preposterous.
Well, it's a matter of public record that he was
It is not.
He was paid.
Is not.
He was paid $2 million by the U.S. government.
That?
Well, you see who said it? It's a matter now. It's a commonplace. It's a commonplace now.
Who are you saying got paid $2 million?
Mr. Gauci was paid $2 million by the United States government. Now, I mean, look, we can butt heads on this, so let's segue to another point. You say that there were some differences in his 19 interviews. Let's deal with one of them, or two of them. He said that McGrahy, the man who bought the clothing in the shop, was a man in his 60s, and who was...
I'm not that familiar with what he said.
I'm surprised you're not. Well, I'm surprised you're not familiar, as you're so adamant about.
I'm surprised that you don't recognize that 8 judges found him to be credible.
Frank, we're talking about.
You're saying he's not.
Well, Frank, I'm surprised that you are not too familiar with his evidence, because his evidence was, of course, decisive in the case, as I think you yourself identified, and certainly decisive.
That was hardly the. There was a huge amount, an overwhelming amount of evidence, and that was only one part of it.
Okay, well let me.
No, wait a second. You wait. Mr. McGrahy lied to the court about where he was. He lied about having been in Malta. He lied about using a false name. He lied about having a false passport. He lied about being in the store, flying in and out on the same day. The man lied under oath 5 or 6 times. Judges saw that. Judges decided what they were going to believe. Now, you can believe Professor Black and Dr. Swire and all of these cranks, or you can believe the 8 judges.
Cranks? Did you just call Dr. Jim Swire and Professor Robert Black cranks?
No, I said the other cranks.
No, I think
don't try and put words in my mouth.
Unfortunately for you, the words that you did speak are now on tape.
Okay, that's fine. If I said that, I shouldn't have said it.
No, you shouldn't have.
Wrong.
No, you shouldn't have. You really shouldn't have, especially as you, by your own admission, are not that familiar with what Mr. Gauci said.
I am very familiar with this case. I'm far more familiar than you are.
No, I can assure you you're not.
That this man was guilty, and he was found guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Now, that's over. It's done. Listen, even Kenny McCaskill said he was guilty.
Well, I can assure you that you know nothing about me, and you therefore know nothing about my knowledge of this case. But let me fill in some of the gaps.
Listen, I'm sorry. I don't have time. Life is short. I don't have any more time to waste with people like you or Professor Black. I'm sorry. I've got to go now. Bye-bye.
Well, there we have a man who is the president of Pan Am Flight 103 victims, although he doesn't know how many families he actually represents, and is not that familiar with the evidence given by the key witness in the case, who then calls Professor Black and Dr. Jim Swire, who lost his daughter in the crash, a crank, and then hangs up. So you can judge the quality of his contribution for yourselves.